Okay, fantastic. Thanks for jumping on the call, both of you. Maybe just by way of kicking off, let's do some introductions so that people know who they're talking to. David, maybe get started with you.
Hi guys, I'm David. I ran an IT services company for 17 and a half years and retired a few years ago off the back of the commercial property investments that I made along the way and continue to make. And today I'll be sharing the story of that journey and how we fired off the back of commercial property.
Thanks, mate. How old were you when you fired?
51.
51. Okay, nice, very nice. I'm targeting that age bracket as well. I'm about 2 years off.
Very good.
How about you, Nelson? Tell me about your background.
I'm a civil engineer by trade. Didn't do too much civil engineering. Went into property development, worked for the most of the big ASX listed developers.
Nice.
Did a stint in Dubai on one of the palms, came back, more property development, and then basically said enough. So I'm in home loans at the moment, doing mortgages. And basically, yeah, I do a lot of other stuff on the side as well, like property syndications and stuff, to get the passive income. So semi-retired in a way, but not semi-retired. So
Gotcha. Awesome. So a big part of the reason why I do stuff like this is just to learn from other people. And David's kindly put together some material that walks through his journey. David, maybe if you put up your slides, so we can walk through that together.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, mate.
So welcome to Dave's property journey. I've titled it Up and Out, partly because I fly and I get up and out, but I also built up a commercial property portfolio, and I'll explain to you throughout this why I'm now exiting. It does come with all the standard disclaimers. Don't follow me, I'm crazy. I won't work for anyone. So I had to build a business. I made it grow fast. I was in the BRW Fast 100 3 years in a row, 2007, 8 and 9. I say that looking up because the plaques are still up on the wall here.
Mm-hmm.
It ran for 17 and a half years, but towards the end, my wife took over as the managing director so that I could focus on sales and growth. But in the end, I burned out trying to build it bigger and faster, and that was the time to exit. You'll see the car there with Fly Ski on it. That used to say Combo 9, which was our brand name, Combo.
Mm-hmm.
That was my Cloud 9 that I got around town in to do the deals, and that became Fly Ski, and I then picked up the little yellow thing because life's got to be fun if you're going to be retired. As I said, I am crazy. So in 2019, I burnt out. We sold the business and retired, and that was off the back of our commercial property investments that generated the income we needed to be confident to retire. So things I call fun, speed and numbers. Skiing at 110 kilometres an hour in places like France, flying planes, and yes, blindfolded, also fly in the dark, which is why I had to train under the blinkers there, because that's the equivalent of only being able to see your instruments and nothing outside.
Wow.
And that was the day I picked up my new plane in Sydney. It was a pretty special day. So let me share some facts with you. It took 18 years of saving into a self-managed super fund to be ready to start the commercial property journey. The plan was to maximise our self-managed super fund to generate colossal retirement income purely from rent across 3 properties. We're not afraid of debt. The more the better in the right circumstances, and that's where we talk about good debt versus bad debt.
Mm-hmm.
Good debt is where the money the bank lends you makes you more money and covers the cost of the loan and the repayments. And that's what you can do with the right commercial properties in the right market circumstances. The first commercial property was a good one, thanks to a lot of help. And I will say, don't go on a commercial property journey on your own.
Okay.
You simply don't know how bad it can go. And I'll talk about some of the gotchas tonight. but there are more ways to lose than there are to win, and you only win with a good team. And in my team, there were all sorts of people who worked in the commercial property space. I chose one of them as my buyer's advocate, which was something he did a bit of. He mostly did a lot of advising other people on how to rent properties, but he was good at negotiating leases and doing all the important things that make a commercial property work for you. I also had a commercial builder who walked through the property you can see on the screen here, and turned to me at the end of his walkthrough and said, "Dave, I can give you a property report here on the spot for free, or I can write one up for you on paper that'll be formal, and that'll cost you $15,000.
$15,000.
And he said, "Dave, it's a good property, buy it."
Okay.
But I knew the guy because I'd been in a business relationship with him in a networking group for years, and that was good enough for me. So I didn't need the formal written up report. I should also say I was trained as a mechanical engineer, even though I went into IT, just because engineering wasn't going to move fast enough for me. I could see as we walked through what he was looking at and why he was looking at it, and I understood that this was a good building because there weren't issues with the things he was looking at. So we've avoided bad luck through active management of relationships. And that's really important to understand. The most important relationship when you have a commercial property is with your tenant or tenants, because they are where the money comes from. If your tenant doesn't like you, your commercial property deal will go bad one way or another. So it's about relationships. It's not easy, it's full of risks. Let me stress that enough ways. So some quick facts, because numbers are what it's all about. The NAB Commercial Property Index, right now this is clearly saying that industrial properties are popular and going up in value. CBD hotels are going up, but they're way out of my reach and probably way out of yours too. If you're thinking about offices, don't. If you're thinking about retail, don't. And so the general commercial property index is actually looking pretty negative at the moment. And it's stuff like this that you've got to be able to look at the charts and understand quickly, because there's all sorts of things that are in a slump, which means opportunities coming. If you buy too early, it's your money that's going to disappear because the bank will always get theirs back. So
how long have we been in this slump, mate?
Oh, look, it's fairly recent. It's as little as 6 months.
Okay.
It was heading for a slump for quite a while, and I've been selling properties for 1.5 years now, and literally completed the last deal this week with one piece of paper that was due from a tenant to complete a deal that we've already taken the deposit on. And that was the last property I bought, which will complete the sale in July 2024, a week after the current tenant vacates. So that's been quite a process. We were trying to get a lease extension. The tenant decided they wanted to buy their own office because they perceived the slump, and gave us notice. Then found out they couldn't find anything and extended it. Then found out that they could find something, but they needed a year to get into it. Hence the bizarre July 24 completion of the lease. But they're paying a 20% premium on the rent because they didn't extend the lease. So we're happy, they're happy, and it's a fantastic outcome. But that took months of negotiation and great care not to divulge what buyers were doing while the tenants were negotiating their exit. So it's been a fascinating process. So supply conditions. There's an oversupply of offices, obviously. Workers haven't returned to the office yet. There's a sense that they're going to. More and more businesses are trying to force their staff back to the office more days a week, as they notice the fall off in productivity that I will say was inevitable. Having run a business and seen how people work when they're motivated and in a good crowd, but very quickly lose their motivation when they're isolated. So those issues are going to heat up. So right now offices are in a slump. But if you get the timing right, you might be in the biggest boom we've seen in years, because nobody's building offices, because who'd build more into a slump? Retail's pretty neutral. If a recession strikes, retail's going to struggle, really struggle. Again, that will create the next opportunity, but right now it's not the time to be buying it. Hotels are oversupplied until Airbnb gets more seriously restricted. And that's probably coming because of the housing undersupply in Australia. And I'm not going to talk about residential here. That's a whole different topic.
Yep.
But industrial's very undersupplied, logistics undersupplied. Whilst recession may impact that briefly, we all keep needing things, and manufacturing's coming onshore more and more as supply chains become an issue, and geopolitical instability drives further demand for onshore manufacturing to make sure we can still get what we need. So there is an ongoing opportunity in industrial, but again, at the moment, it's overpriced, and I'll explain more about that. So I want to talk about what we actually did. And I've got numbers here because I think that if the numbers aren't there, people don't believe you. Now, step one for us was to accumulate funds in our self-managed super fund. And we did that through every method we could find. In the early days of our business, when we weren't paying ourselves a salary, we still put the maximum contribution we were allowed to in
well done.
managed super fund. We did start with savings because we'd been very well paid working in London, and that gave us the opportunity to build our business, which didn't pay us money for a good few years as we built it. That's a different story. I won't dwell on that. But after 18 years of accumulating funds into the self-managed super fund from 1994, when I entered the workforce, to 2012, we managed to accumulate $1 million in our super fund. In 2012, we purchased property one. It was $2.72 million and gave us $23,400 a month as a result. And let me just open a spreadsheet that I did recently. I won't share that.
Was that the property that your business was in?
Sorry, say that again.
Was that the property that your business was in?
No. I'll talk about those in a moment.
Okay, gotcha. Separate.
This one was a pure investment. It was actually a food manufacturing plant. And at the time we bought it, it was returning a 10% yield.
Wow.
On the cost of purchase.
Wow. That's amazing these days.
Yeah. That's unheard of these days. But that used to be normal. And in actual fact, the tenant helped us to achieve that in negotiating the sale and the renewal of lease. So we managed to sign a 7-year lease with the tenant, who had told the previous landlord, who he didn't like, if you don't sell the property, I'm going to vacate the building. And that was a big threat in those days because empty buildings were sitting vacant for quite a while at that stage in the market. So in 2013, property two was bought in the family trust, so outside super. That was a $1.34 million acquisition, and we set the rent at $4,973 a month, which was only 4%. And that's because of the nature of the building, and because at the time our business wasn't doing well enough to pay more rent than that. So we deliberately set it pretty low.
Gotcha.
So then, I didn't put the year there, but in 2016, we sold property one for $3.85 million. That was a gain of $1.13 million, plus rent and depreciation. So after 18 years of accumulation, we doubled our super fund in 4 years.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's understanding that the capital gains tax is about 10% on half your capital gain inside super. So it's bugger all, and the speed at which you can accumulate your wealth inside the super fund because of those tax benefits is massive. Now, it's much harder to put $1 million into super today, and it's much harder to get those gains.
Absolutely.
Working the system was what it was all about. This was strategy the strategy at a very high level to achieve the outcome we were looking for. So in 2016, we purchased our new office. It was $3.2 million, and we set the rent at $18,750 a month. That was about as much as we could justify in the market at that stage, because this is now inside the super fund. So the rent from the office, which was taking company profits and paying them straight into our super fund with no contributions tax, was the best way ever to get money into your super fund.
Mm-hmm.
And we set that rent at 7% of the total capitalised value. But what's hidden in that was that $1 million of that $3.2 million was actually the fit out cost, which was paid for by the business.
Mm-hmm.
So the business paid $1 million straight into the super fund
mm-hmm.
without paying contributions tax on it. So we just added another $1 million to super there. And we actually got a tax ruling on this one because we couldn't believe that it was that good. And we said, look, when the office is done with it and we sell the building, does the super fund then own the fit out? And they said, well, of course, the business will have used it, it will have depreciated, there's no other way to do it. Mm-hmm. Of course, was what the tax department said. Yippee, that's a significant gain.
Wow.
The back of smart management and strategy again.
Mm.
But yeah, it was a godsend. So the company profits went into that, which minimised our tax payments against the profit outside super, of course, and boosted our super fund again. We then sold the first office. Oh, that's the sale there in 2017. 2.22 million, so a gain of $0.88 million on that second office, plus rent, and there was a little bit of depreciation, but not much in that case. So in 2018, we purchased the Townsville property. That was 2.925. The rent on that was $26,918 a month initially. That was the equivalent of 11% in 2018. Now, that was because the lease term was short. The property was in Townsville, not a capital city. And so that was pretty normal for the time, but the yield was fantastic. So we then sold the second office after we retired. So that was 2022. Mm-hmm. It sold for $4.2 million, a gain of $1 million plus rent and depreciation, again, adding massive wealth to our self-managed super fund. Now, with those, let me just run through some numbers here. The factory, we purchased on a 10% yield. We sold it on an 8% yield. Mm-hmm. The first office we bought on a 4% yield. We sold it on a 3% yield. Mm-hmm. The second office, we initially set the rent at a 7% yield, but when we sold it on a 6% yield. That's despite the fact that the rents went up about 3% mm-hmm. each year. So the rents went up and the yield went down, driving the cost through the roof. So, then the final property, which was sold, well, will be sold in 2024, we purchased on an 11% yield and sold on a 9% yield. And the rent on that one went from $26,918 a year to $28,523, sorry, not a year, a month. So 26, or no, call it 27 to 28.5. That extra increase in rent and the decrease in yield is where the capital gain comes from.
Yep. And
the reason that's important is because I'm going to talk about, well, let me talk about how we won. Next slide. The total gains amount to over $4 million. And the increase in value came from 4 areas. The increase in rent due to inflation, the decreased yield expectation from 10 to 8 and 4 to 3 and 7 to 6 and 11 to 9, which was also because yield expectations decreased as interest rates decreased. Had the interest rates stayed the same, the yield expectation would have stayed the same, because there's a strong connection between yield and interest rate, because the interest rate determines what the bank will lend you against the income from the property. If the income isn't high enough from the property, you need to put in a lot more cash to buy the property. So given that people want to gear their properties and they only want to put in 20 or 30% as their contribution, the yield affects, or the interest rate affects the yield that will be demanded. So then improved demand for specific areas. Certainly in the case of our offices, they were in trendy parts of town, Fitzroy North and then East Brunswick. Those areas went up in demand, and offices in the inner city became more popular. And so that drove a little bit of the capital gains that we could achieve as well. And then value added to the property with the quality of the fit out. With our first office, we added a bit of value. In fact, with our first factory, we added a bit of value as part of the negotiation with the tenant. We agreed to put in $110,000 worth of capital improvements, which he chose and managed and ran. So it was the addition of capital value that also improved the property that led to the improved capital value on sale. And that's fairly important. When you have an asset, a big asset, you want to have a way to add value to it as well, because that ensures you're going to get a capital gain. And it's always a multiple of the capital that you, or the cash that you put in to improve the asset. So the quickest way to make money is to buy a commercial property nobody wants to go into because it looks bad, clean it up and get a tenant into it. You can actually flip commercial properties very effectively. I may well be doing that in a couple of years' time, just for fun, because you can make money so fast, it's not funny, but not in the current market because there's too much risk. So what was involved in getting those outcomes? We did the account management. We didn't let commercial agents get between us and the tenants.
Interesting.
That way we knew what was going on, and we knew what the tenants wanted, and we could negotiate with the tenants and say, look, that's a capital cost, we'll cover it. That's not a capital cost. That's part of your cost as a commercial tenant. And so instead of just getting bills from the agent who negotiated to keep life simple for the agent, we could negotiate with the tenants and make sure that they were happy with the solution and we were happy financially and emotionally. We were our own tenants for 2 of the properties, obviously. I can't stress it enough. There's no better way to get ahead than to build a business that needs a lot of property and own the property. You will always be your best tenant. You'll always find a way to make it pay. I didn't mention when we sold the first office out of the trust, because it was our primary place of business, we were allowed to roll the capital gain into, or the portion of the capital gain that was subject to tax, we were able to roll into our super fund and pay no capital gain on the property that was outside of super. So that caused us to put money into super through a rule, again, no contributions tax, avoided capital gains tax. It's, you know, these things are set up to help business owners to retire with money, to say thanks for providing jobs for employees. And you need to run a business to really get ahead in life. So first office, capital gains rolled into super. Second office done inside super. We ensured we had solid leases in place with well-written agreements, and that included, when we were the tenants, we wrote leases that we were happy to sign on both sides of the agreement. And at the point where we sold our business, there was still a 2-year lease outstanding on the office we owned. And the company that bought our business bought the lease and responsibility for keeping on paying us at a rental rate that we'd set at top of the market, with ratchets to go up each year. So the lease was actually one of the ways we made a real profit selling the business. So keep that in mind too. We managed the tenants to ensure they were happy with the properties, and we sold at the right point where we felt capital gains had been maximised. So we'd paid off a chunk of the property over a few years, and then we could get the capital gain out of the property and then multiply the asset base. And I need to clarify that for you. Inside super, you cannot redraw on a loan, and you cannot use a property or equity as collateral for another loan. These are limitations of the self-managed super funds. And so we were kind of forced to sell the properties we had, which has a cost of stamp duty and selling costs. But we were forced to sell them to scale up the amount of property we had in our super fund. So we sold one and we bought two,
Gotcha.
which also diversified our risk and made it easier to go on to make the following capital gains across our second and third properties inside super. So we sold at the right point for that, and we used tax benefits of the self-managed super fund to our advantage absolutely everywhere we could.
David, how did you determine that was the right point to sell?
It was the point at which we could get enough out of the one property to buy two.
Gotcha.
And it was very clear to us that we now had enough equity that to keep paying down the small amount of debt we had relative to the equity wasn't going to give us a significant capital gain.
Mm-hmm.
And also the yields had dropped. So it was a good time in the market. And we didn't know that they were going to keep falling, but we kept playing the game as long as we could see them falling.
Mm-hmm.
At the point where we could see interest rates going up, we hit the sell button on everything we could. Because
Gotcha.
The reverse game is now in play. And I'll talk about that in a moment too. We used intelligence and capability to make this work. We generated our own spreadsheets. We're not people to go out and find a spreadsheet on the internet and try and plug our numbers into it and hope it works. I'm a mechanical engineer and have calculated the heat flow through an engine block using a my wife is a business analyst and programmer and is perfectly happy to write macros and code. But I just literally went into one of our spreadsheets where we calculated the returns we expected from our property and stuck them on here. They mean nothing, but you can see that they're fairly complex. It's not just A plus B equals C stuff in a spreadsheet. And in fact, we have spreadsheets that pull data from other spreadsheets and pages that pull data from other pages in our spreadsheets and macro formulas that show us what will happen over time, which probably isn't normal stuff, but we don't like being surprised by our numbers. We're not afraid to create the formulas that give us the answers we're looking for. And then when the answers don't make sense, we go back and check the formulas. But we're two pretty mathematically capable people that use maths to make sure we win. We do not buy property emotionally. We buy it by the numbers, for the numbers, and manage it with the numbers. But we look after people and emotions to make sure we maximize the profit. So it's not one-sided. It's a multi-dimensional equation. But if you think that you'll just grab a commercial property and have a crack, think about whether you've really got the mathematical skills and relationship skills to carry it off.
Already, mate, I'm seeing that a lot of people lump property into the same bucket, but already I'm seeing that residential and commercial are almost two completely different animals, two different species entirely.
Very much so. And let me say, what I'm sharing here is my commercial property journey. It is only one of our investment vehicles. And we play other games as well because we like to spread our risk too. So this is just part of our game, but it's the part we're talking about tonight. So it all worked. None of it was easy. If you can't create complex spreadsheets and trust your own numbers, don't go into commercial property. It's a complex game. And everybody out there wants your money and will abuse it. So don't jump in if you're not an analytical type, and if you can't figure out what the risks are in the game you're stepping into. And no one will do it for you. We actually sold our second office to a woman who manages commercial property for investors. So she brought in a team of investors and they bought the property. But I recognised the situation and was able to extract a 10% higher value for the property because I knew that she couldn't make money until the deal was done. So if you're thinking about buying part of a commercial property with a property manager, be assured that they will make the profit you think you should, and you will break even at best. You might make a tiny amount of money, but you're better off owning your own residential property and taking the slings and arrows with that than trusting somebody else to manage your money inside a commercial property.
Correct, because they got their hands in the cookie jar.
Yeah, that's right. They've actually got a conflict of interest from the day they buy the property. They'll overpay for the property using your money because they get a commission for buying it. And it's just a whole dodgy game that I strongly recommend people don't get into, because yes, people make a lot of money from commercial property, but not by buying part of a commercial property. Possible exception to that are some of the big property trusts. Growth Point was one of my clients when I was in business. They own billions of dollars worth of property, including airports and things like that. When commercial property does well, the holders in a scheme like that will also do well just because of the scale of it. But I have to say, they had a lovely office with the biggest TV screen I've ever seen, and the shareholders were paying for that. You know, the profits don't flow straight to the investors. They flow through the business takes their money out of it, and then it flows through to the investors. So direct investment managed well will do better for you. So I'll show you the properties quickly to put some images to the story. Property 1, this is the factory that we bought. There were about 60 people working there. I think it had 32 car parks. It was 2,500 square metres of real estate or something.
That's not small.
Yeah, not small. Small properties are too much of a nightmare to manage. Small businesses come and go. You want something big that has a real cost to moving. I think I mentioned before, if this guy had moved because he wasn't happy with his landlord, it would have cost him $1 million to move. But the cost of not getting the landlord to respond to his problems was costing him enough that he'd spend $1 million to have a reset. Very good business, and make sure the business that you're putting in there is a good business. I didn't actually talk about that, but one of the important things when I'll talk about that, I've got a slide on choosing the property, so I'll get to that. So our first office was a 2-story building. We actually had a lawyer sublet upstairs, or lease upstairs from us. He did help us with some of our commercial dealings, so that was quite handy. But that was where we built the business to the next level. And when we bought it, it was empty and looking pretty sad. We spent about $100,000 cleaning that up. Might have been a bit less, maybe 80. But we had to spend money to fit it out and make it work as a business. But we ran a business out of there for 4 years, 5 years. And that was 500 metres from home, so it was very convenient for us. And then we moved into this one as our business. We had the whole first floor of that tower. You can see the glass there from right to left. That whole glass bit was our office. You can see our 4 company cars lined up there. It was a good time in business, and we continued to grow. So we fitted out the kitchen to look pretty flashy, had the nice coffee machine and microwaves and sandwich presses and all of that, because keeping your staff happy is really hard. I talked before about adding value when you buy a building. The top image there is what the place looked like when we moved in. It was just an empty shell from end to end. And I walked into this and looked left and right and just went, wow, so much natural light, so much space. It's perfect. And then the bottom is what we turned it into, fairly modern, trendy looking office with rows and rows of desks. We could house 64 staff in that office, but I burned out before I got there.
Mate, you shared an incredible cheat code. And so the business paid for the fit out, but when you sold the actual building, all of that money flowed straight back into the super fund.
Yeah.
And part of the capital appreciation of the building that you sold was the actual fit out.
Correct.
That's a phenomenal cheat code to be able to funnel more money into Australia's best tax haven, which is superannuation.
Correct.
Okay, that's a cool hack.
Mm. Oh, and I can't wait for a 60th birthday to happen around here. Heyday of our lives.
Oh yeah.
Or pay rise, yeah, can't wait, because you know, we're slumming it now.
Hardly, you're hardly slumming it. I've seen the Facebook posts.
Yeah, and I will be traveling for 12 of the next 12 weeks of the next 4 months.
Oh, nice.
It's a hard life. So yeah, three out of 4 months I'll be traveling, and I'm just starting to plan the travels for when I get back from that. But you got to do something, right?
When you hit 60, you'll be able to afford to travel full time.
Yeah. So we then did the property in Townsville, and this was it. I went up to have a look at it before we made the decision to buy it, and I looked at it, and the tenant maintains the grounds and the building and pays for all the outgoings, and it was like, yeah, this is a nice office, and inside was lovely too. I don't have photos to share of the inside, but it's a really nice office. People walk in and go, oh wow, this would be a nice place to work. And so we bought that in let me see, we bought that in 2018, so we've owned that for just over 5 years. I've been back up there once to talk to the tenants when I was trying to get them to sign a new lease for 5 years, which didn't work. But that's it. It's been managed completely remotely the whole time we've owned it. We spend a bit of time on the phone talking to them, but commercial property doesn't take a lot of effort to manage because the tenants maintain their own property. So that's pretty good.
What are sort of challenges or phone calls that you get from a tenant?
Oh, look, it's rained and the roof's leaked and the inside ceiling's collapsed. Can you get it fixed? And we go, have you got quotes for that? Because of who the tenant was, they'd often say, yes, we have. And we'd just say, all right, go ahead with that and get it fixed. Or we'd call the roof plumber and go, can you go and fix the leak? And then we'd suggest that they fix the internals to suit themselves. And actually insurance would pay for that. So it didn't matter. Issues with air conditioning. Hey, the air conditioning's not working. Okay, we call the air conditioning guy and get him to go in and fix it, because that's on us for some reason, not them. Sometimes they'd call us and tell us about problems, and we'd go, well, that's a maintenance issue and it's on you. And they'd go, oh yeah, we'll get it fixed. In fact, in this picture, you can see the signpost out the front here. We got a letter from council telling us that the bolts around the bottom had rusted, and the sign had become a hazard and needed to be dealt with. And we went, well, it's their sign, it's not our problem. So we forwarded the letter to them, and next time we heard anything about it, they just pulled the sign out and removed the bit of concrete.
Oh, okay.
Problem
so they
gone.
erected the sign after they'd leased the property.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so often the problems aren't your problems and you're just in the middle of them. But it's always asking the question legally, is this our responsibility or yours? And that's where having your advisors that you can fall back to and go, hey, mate, the tenant's saying this to me. Is it on us or is it on them? And sometimes it's a fine line. We had one where there was something going wrong in the bathrooms, and they claimed that it was a common area and therefore not their responsibility. And we scratched our head and went, what do you mean common area? There's only one tenant. So common to who? And they went, Oh, yeah, yeah. In other buildings we lease, that would be the landlord's problem, but you're right, in this case, it's our problem. And sometimes we'd look at things that were a $500 charge and go, look, really, it's their problem, but we'll just cover it because we don't want another argument, because
Yep.
relationship. So it's about balance and being equitable and getting the deal done. So that's the journey to here. What we are doing, we're getting out of commercial property completely. Because capital values have shot up as yield expectations go down, we figure that capital values are at their peak now, and there's only losses to be made from here. When our tenant didn't renew their lease, they took us by surprise, and we turned to the real estate agent in Townsville, who we have a great relationship with, and said, mate, put it up for sale or lease. Had we found a tenant that would take it for 5 years that was a good tenant, we'd probably have kept the property and just ridden the dip and not worried too much about the capital value, because we were happy with the cash flow that the property would generate.
Mm-hmm.
But he found us a buyer rather than a tenant. Mm-hmm. So we'll sell the property, and we're very happy with the price negotiated, because of the capital gain that it gives us inside super, so we won't pay a lot of tax on it once again. And that sets us up to go and buy in the next buying round to set ourselves up for 30 years of retirement with good cash flow. Our properties were aging and at risk of being empty for long periods. That's never a good thing as a landlord. Empty properties don't just stop paying you money, but they keep costing you money.
Yeah.
You've still got to pay your insurance, you've still got to pay your land tax, and you might need to keep the electricity on just to run a security system. And then if anyone vandalizes it, you've got to pay for repairs. Empty commercial properties are the biggest nightmare you can imagine.
Yeah.
So if you don't have a long-term tenant, you have a long-term problem. Which is also why an empty property sells for a fraction of its leased value. Mm-hmm. And the value of a commercial property is actually calculated based on the rental yield. Mm-hmm. And what determines the yield is the interest rate that the banks are going to charge you on the loan that you use to buy the place. Mm-hmm. So there's this whole balancing equation that goes on between the rent that the market will pay, and for offices right now, that's not very much. So offices are a poor investment at the moment. The interest you're going to have to pay on the loan and the yield that you can calculate or get in your purchasing decision. There are still people buying commercial properties on 4% yields. And I have to assume that those people are using cash to buy the properties, and they're happy with a 4% return on their money. And I go, you can get a bond for 10 years with 5% plus yield at the moment. Yeah. Why would you buy a property with risk for 4% instead of just taking out a bond? It makes no sense. And when it makes no sense, I see nothing but risk. So I sit there and go, there's got to be a better way to make money than buying a low-yield commercial property. And of course, everybody that's bought those low-yield commercial properties over the last few years, and I'm talking in Australia here, I'm not going to talk for international, but here in Australia, they were buying for anywhere from 3 to 5%, and 5% was a great yield in those days, but they're now paying 6 to 8% for the money that they've borrowed.
Yeah.
So they're underwater, and they must be negative gearing on those commercial properties. And from my perspective, I do not understand how they make money on that. In fact, I'd love to have someone explain to me why that's a good deal, especially given that as the yield expectation goes back up, the capital value has to come down. That's just the balance in the equation. And I believe there's something similar in the bond market where as yields go up, the capital values come down, but then when the yield expectation comes back down, the bond values with the higher yields go up. Someone can explain that to me one day too. I don't play bonds. The tenants gave notice, and that was time to sell. And we also sold, as I mentioned before, because our super fund limited our ability to borrow against those assets. So we get to scale up next time commercial property makes sense to buy. So we believe there's about to be a new bargain buying season, and that'll be when interest rates are acknowledged to be high and those yield values come back up. I had a conversation with a real estate agent just today where I made an inquiry on a property that looks really nice, happens to be in Rockhampton, and he suggested that that property would sell on a 6% yield, which priced it at about $5.5 million. And I said to him, look, that'll be nice for the owner if they can get it, but I'm not in the market till I can get at least a 7.5% yield. And he said, would you really be interested at 7.5%? And I said, yes. And he said, look, I'll talk to the owner and I'll come back to you. That just might be possible. So with that statement, he said that owner might be prepared to take $1 million reduction on his expectation of price.
That's a big cut.
That's a big cut, isn't it? I wouldn't want that cut to happen to me, but that owner's about to. So he'll still be making a reasonable gain from what he paid for it in 2018, back when we bought the property in Townsville. But the owner is now accepting that that top price that he might have got a year ago just isn't available in the marketplace because interest rates have gone up. And so the market is starting to go where I always thought it was going to, and that is that as interest rates go up, the prices come down. And so they lose, we win. Now, at 7.5% sitting in my super fund, paying me, that one was going to be about $340,000 a year. By the time I hit 60 in 3 years' time, actually my wife hit 60 in 3 years' time, she's a year older than me, that would actually equate to exactly $1,000 a day in my pocket from one of my 3 properties in my super fund that I'll be retiring with. So do your little thinking on that.
Retiring really well.
So there's a new bargain season coming. Through selling each time we got to scale up, and we'll do so one more time before sitting back and living a relaxed lifestyle. So, you know, this is the final round of acquisition. I expect to keep the properties we buy now for 20 to 30 years. We'll be looking for things that are very new. And let's move on to the next slide. I'll be looking for properties that are pretty new, have high depreciation benefits, because depreciation is basically tax you don't have to pay on your income. So that improves your income significantly. And I'll be looking for things that have very stable tenants. So, you know, I'll be looking for things like, I'll get onto that. I've actually got that on the next slide. But so how do you choose a property? It's quality of the property. Don't buy something that's going to fall apart and need strong maintenance to keep the tenant there. If a wall falls over on your property, the tenant's not paying for that under maintenance. If it was painted when the tenant got there and it needs repainting, yes, the tenant will pay for that. But mechanical failures, structural failures, those sorts of things, roof leaks, roof failures, they're a landlord expense. And, you know, with something like that first factory we bought, it had a new roof on it. That roof had cost $500,000.
Wow.
If you're collecting a few $100,000 a year rent and all of a sudden after 2 years you've got a new roof to put on something like that, you're so far underwater it'll take you years to recover. So you've got to keep a buffer of a few $100,000 for that, or a big air conditioning system that fails, or whatever it is. But you want to buy a building that isn't going to have those issues too early in the lease, but then you've got to expect them down the track. So again, it's not for people that are all out to buy a property. You've still got to have a buffer, especially if it's inside super. You have a $300,000 blowout inside your super fund and the $300,000 isn't there to spend, your super fund just became non-compliant because you've got to pump money in there from somewhere and you can't do that legally. So strategy and planning, know your risks, plan your your problems and have a buffer. So you want to have a share portfolio inside super as well. You can't have everything on commercial property, for example. So quality of tenant. Don't buy a little shop with Mick the fruiterer running it. Because when Mick has a bad month and goes broke, he breaks the lease and you've got an empty shop. And if he's having a bad month, chances are retail's having a bad month, and nobody's going to move in there until it turns around. Or people will come and offer you less rent. When you get less rent, you've got to make up the difference to keep paying the mortgage. So you want to find a big enough property to get an ASX listed company or a global company, or at least somebody that's got a great track record. And maybe in the case of the factory, they were selling through Coles and Woolworths. And it was like, they're not going anywhere. They're going to keep selling their product, and they're going to stay there for as long as they can because of the cost of relocation. Look at the quality of the lease. If you don't know how to read a lease, make sure you've got a lawyer who reads the lease looking for risk and cost. And in a lease, there can be massive liability or massive benefit. So you've got to be able to read through those legal terms and understand who's going to pay when it goes wrong, how the tenant can get out of their lease, whether they've paid a security. And you want to get a 6-month bond or a 6-month cover note or something in place, so that you're not left broke if the tenant goes broke, and you've got a bit of a buffer there to find a new tenant before the money runs out. Look at the length of lease. We call that the WALE on a property, and sometimes you've got multiple tenants, and agents will talk about the average WALE or the WALE of the property, which might be 3.5 years, but you might have one tenant that's there for a year and another one that's there for 5. Will it still stack up if you have an empty part of your commercial property? And can you find a tenant to fill that space? So you want to not just look at the WALE of the whole building, but the length of lease for each of the tenants, because each tenancy is part of your income. So then you look at yield. Yield is it. Yield determines the value of your property in every market, always. If you've got a low yield, you're going to be in trouble one day. The higher the yield you can get, the more wriggle room there is, the more cash flow you get along the way. And when I say that, positive cash flow, if you can be making an extra $5,000 a month out of your commercial property, that's $5,000 that you can put towards the maintenance fund or put towards your personal cash flow if it's a problem. So it's always good to have good yield. And if you get low yield, when the yield curve changes, it'll cost you a fortune. I've talked about the cost to the tenant of relocation. The property that I talked about just before, where the agent said that they'll take $4.5 million now, I've been told that the tenant just spent $5 million on the fit out of their that's in there. So they've got some heavy duty cranes and things in there. Cost them $5 million to get in there. They're not going anywhere.
They're not going anywhere.
And that's the kind of thing I'm looking for. I'm not looking for just an empty shed for warehousing. Yes, warehousing's popular right now. Logistics companies love them, but there's always another empty warehouse. And so if they can save $100,000 moving down the road next year, they'll just start putting their pallets in there, and 3 months later, they don't need your site anymore, and they'll do that changeover to save $100,000 a year. But moving $5 million worth of kit, nah, that's not worth the trouble of even thinking about. When the lease is up for renewal, you send them a renewal notice 6 months out, and they go, where do we sign? And that's what you want. You want options as well. People talk about, a 5-year lease with 2-3 year options. Businesses are less inclined to move when they just need to sign an option and they already know the site and they already know the terms of the lease. There's no risk in it for them to stay, so they won't move on. But when the options are up and the lease might suddenly jump up by 5 or 10% in cost each year, they'll start shopping around. just in case they can save that $100,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so a shopping around tenant is a risk to you, and that's a risk to your capital. So you want a long lease with options in your favour, because that adds value to your property. And is it unique in a good way or a bad way? And by that I mean, if the tenant does leave, is there something unique about the property that will make somebody else want it? And what we discovered in Townsville when the tenant vacated was, actually, there isn't another office of that scale anywhere outside of the CBD in Townsville, and in the CBD is much more expensive than the office that we had. So in fact, we found a buyer who was in the CBD in a rented office who wanted to own their own office. So they became an owner-occupier of our office, and it was actually the scarcity of a large office outside the CBD that suited the buyer. And so we got lucky. You know, we could have had a situation where that office up there was empty for a year. We're in a position now where we could fund that, but it would have been a cost to the super fund. But we've got a 1 week gap between the tenant vacating and the new owners moving in, because the new owners didn't want the issues to deal with of end of lease and vacating. We think they're mad because they're paying stamp duty and they're paying GST, because it's not a going concern when they take it. But they're a semi-government organisation, maybe they don't pay the GST. But yeah, it's always good to have some unique point to what you've got, so that if you lose your tenant, you'll get a new one. Unique in a bad way, of course, is it's only any good for the tenant. If he leaves, we'll have to spend a fortune to redesign what we've got.
Yeah.
And I think childcare is a great example of that. You buy a childcare facility, and if childcare disappears because the government stops subsidising it and people decide that actually their parents can look after the kids, your childcare facility is back to being a domestic house at best. And that's a real risk. So you won't see me buying childcare. So what am I looking for now? And this is my last slide. So we'll hand over to Nelson in a moment. I'm looking for a change in market that sees yields return to favourable levels. And I think that's going to happen fairly quickly, because the interest rates are high and people are realising they can't hang on to the properties they've got. So they're going to take a haircut and sell to me. I'm looking for a property that's recession-proof. I've got some examples here. A supermarket. People always need food. They'll always go to a supermarket. You don't see supermarkets closing down. A health facility, because people will always go to the doctors and look after their health. A vet clinic, because people will always look after their animals. A food manufacturer or other critical manufacturer. Obviously, the car industry shut down. Anyone that owned those sorts of businesses where the automotive manufacturing was being done, they took a haircut when automotive left Australia. But there are things coming back in with high-tech manufacturing that could be quite good investments at the moment in the industrial space. I do like the idea of warehouses with big robots in them, where the tenant pays for the robot, but relocating those robotic systems is frightfully expensive. So once they're there leasing the space off you and they put their robot in it, you've got them for 20 years. And they'll make money because of the robot, and you'll all be happy. That's
a good tip.
Fast food outlets, you know, in a newer state, a fast food outlet's always popular. The problem is they typically sell on a very low yield because they're a very safe, very well-known investment, and they tend to be under a few $1 million, unless it's a very big McDonald's or something. But the yield will be low. But if you're happy with a low yield, that's a very secure investment that's well understood and well known and won't go broke in a recession. It's not one I'd buy because of the low yield. Other specialist plays with big infrastructure investments, and I mentioned the warehousing with a robot. They're great. So I'm looking for reducing interest rates, because once interest rates start coming down, yield will play in my benefit. So if I take out a loan at 8%, because that's the going rate for a commercial loan, because the banks like to cover themselves for the risk in commercial property, if that comes down to 6% just after I've purchased, then I'm 2% better off in what I'm taking home. Whereas while interest rates are going up, people are getting worse and worse off, which is what's forcing the sales, which is what's driving the prices down. So, you know, now is the pain time in the cycle. After it gets to the bottom of the pain comes the biggest opportunity of our lifetimes.
When you owned the property, were the mortgages on the commercial property fixed or variable?
Mostly variable. When I saw this yield change coming, I ran to the bank and said, lock us in. Unfortunately, the bank didn't listen to me the first time, and we got locked in just after the first 1/4% rise. So
still not bad.
We're still paying 4.49%
on
our commercial loans.
Yep.
So we're pretty happy. We're actually quite sad that we're going to break that next year when we sell, because who can get money at 4.49%?
Nobody. You can't get that for residential property now.
No, that's right. And so letting that go is actually a disadvantage to us, and we would have done very well to keep our tenant for a few more years and just ride out the dip in value. Because if you're collecting your rent based on the higher yield previously, care what the capital value is. And this is what I'm looking for in the next round. I want to lock in my annual returns of a few $100,000 a year. And then I don't care what the capital value is. That will be my children's problem when they inherit the properties out of the super fund. As far as I'm concerned, they'll just be a cash cow forever. Indexed to inflation, of course, because the rent goes up every year based on CPI or 3.5%, whatever you agree in the lease.
Good problem to have.
It's a great problem to have. So every year your income goes up, indexed with inflation for the rest of your life in retirement. What have you got to worry about now? Where will we be having our gin and tonics this evening? So yeah, long leases and little government involvement I've talked about, no childcare. If it's government funded today, when the government stops spending money, it might not be government funded tomorrow. And that's when the value of the properties will absolutely plummet in that sector.
Unless you're
Having said that, if it's a government agency that's your tenant and they've got a long lease, well, that's good money, because then the government always pays for their leases and they never break their leases. So it's understanding those dynamics in the market on the way in, and you make your money when you buy. Unless you are a commercial property renovator, then you make your money by the value you add to the property. But adding value to a property is always good, whether it's residential or commercial, because it improves the capital value or the leasing value. But by and large, you make your money in property when you buy, because the market determines how you sell.
You mentioned earlier that you're probably thinking about doing some flipping when you in your retirement, because you kind of enjoy the process.
Yeah, so we're involved with flipping residential properties at the moment.
Okay.
We went and did a course 2 weeks after we sold our business, because we still need to make exceptional profits on our money outside super, because we didn't leave enough outside super to really, you know, put it in conservative investments and sit back and relax for 9 years. So to make our money work a bit harder, we thought we'd be flipping properties. What we discovered was that we had enough money that all we actually needed to do was invest in other people's projects. So we will buy a residential property that somebody else wants to renovate. They'll renovate it and we'll do profit share on it. And I'm looking at that going, man, when nobody wants commercial property anymore because they've all been burnt by it, there are going to be some colossal opportunities to buy relatively simple properties, give them a lick of paint, put a few shelves in, and sponsor a tenant into it. So you might pick somebody that has bought a franchise of something like a pizza joint and go, look, we'll pay for the signage. You just wheel your pizza ovens in and start doing business.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as they're in there doing business with a 7-year lease, you sell it to the next investor that wants a fast food joint, and you get a massive capital gain on the property that you just did the flip on. So I can see the potential for that. Now's not the time because the yields are coming down and you could actually burn your money rather than making it.
Yeah.
But once commercial property values bottom out and everyone's being burnt, there's going to be massive opportunities in vacant, not very attractive properties.
In terms of the cycles of commercial property and residential property, is there an alignment or is there a lag between one and the other?
Yeah, I'm not enough of an analyst and comparer to answer that question, so I'll leave that to people that are more into the data and across the charts on it.
I personally believe it's all to do with the economy and the people's willingness to spend, because that's what drives industry, which drives jobs, and immigration as well. So when you say, are they both aligned? I probably wouldn't say they're aligned. There probably is a lag. How much of a lag is really dependent on everyone's pulse on their money and what the economy is doing at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
I do think we're about to see a really big problem come out of America with the commercial properties there that are overvalued at the moment. And people are starting to have to actually declare the real value. And by people, I mean banks. And those banks are holding assets at their pre-pandemic values, but they're worth a fraction of that today because they're empty and nobody would buy them for anywhere close to that book value. And the banks are about to have to declare the real values with the end of financial year, having just gone through and
it's also the same with the REITs as well.
That's going to cause a problem.
I think it's almost the same as the REITs as well, because they got to declare the actual value as we go along. But yeah, watch that space.
Yeah, I just want to share an article with you. I brought it up while you were talking, but there are some distressed properties in San Francisco where property was just ridiculously overpriced. Let me know if we can see the screen.
Yep.
But up to 50% falls in property. That's just absolutely insane. Absolutely insane.
Well, we've already seen that in Australia, and this is anecdotal, I know, but there's a hotel on Collins Street that was bought by a big offshore fund. I think they paid $700 million for the property.
Yep.
And sold it 3 years later for some 300 or 400 million.
Wow.
And I was told that by one of the agents at JLL who was across the deal. I was like, when these big companies get it wrong and they're told to get out of it, or they have to get out of it for some reason, be it banks or their commitment to financing or shareholders or whatever, they just cut their losses and bang, 50% loss and on they go. But it's not their money. It's their investors that lose.
That's true.
And, that's fine. But I'm a personal investor. This is my money, my outcomes, my future. And so I don't want to be on the losing side of one of these multi-million-dollar deals ever. That wipes out years of hard work and smart achievement that you just don't want to have in your name.
Thanks for David. That was an amazing journey, and I appreciate you sharing that in a lot of detail. I learned an awful lot about some of the cheat codes that you used.
Thanks.
And like you, I've got my approach to fire is similar to yours, whereas I don't think of retirement as something that happens when you're 67. It's almost like a relay race. You need to have enough capital to get you to 60, where you can start to tap into that superannuation, and you need to have enough in superannuation to last you until you're however long. But most people don't think of it as a two-stage race, and most people don't realize that the toughest part that they need to figure out isn't funneling enough into super, because that is relatively easy, but how to make sure they've got enough from the point in time they retire to 60. That's the challenge, because that's not the tax effective part.
Yes, that's part of it. But the other thing people don't realise is that as you get your money working for you and your money is making money, but you're still working and saving, your rate of saving accelerates massively.
True. Yes.
And you'll save more in your last 5 years of working than you do in your first 15 or 20.
Yep.
Because you've got your increased salary, because you're now good at what you do and being paid your higher rates, and you've got your savings working hard for you in a property that's gaining capital value and everything else, and your savings go through the roof. I mean, that first thing from 2012 through to 2016, going from 1 million in super to 2 million in super, you just don't do that unless you start saving.
Yep.
And people, it was 18 years of hard work, earning money like everybody does to make the first mil. Yeah. Yes, we have some shortcuts. We chose places to work that paid us well for what we did.
Yep.
We didn't settle for standard incomes. We changed jobs, and we went to London in 1998 because I'd heard that people were being paid colossal incomes for doing IT work there.
Yep.
And yeah, we got that right. We got paid, twice, even 3 times what we'd have earned if we stayed home in Melbourne.
And then the exchange rate on the way back.
That's what made the money.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so if you're prepared to do things like that in your working life, but then you back that up with sensible savings and sensible investments, you can get to 51 with I never need to work again attitude, and the money to back it up. But if I could have driven much more expensive cars and had more expensive hobbies earlier in life. And I didn't go without, but I certainly didn't spend what I could have because I was busy saving. That was also because we were pretty sure IT was moving so fast it was going to leave us behind. It kind of did. I burnt out. We could have kept going, but we'd done enough. And so we let it go, let it wash over us. And today I'm as technically incompetent as the next person because Microsoft moved all the buttons again.
Yeah, I'm like you. I've spent a lifetime in technology, but I'm at the point now where I'm looking at the pace of change and improvement in blockchain and also AI, and I can't keep up. It's like every new day there's a new headline. It's just phenomenal. It feels like we're in the .com era all over again.
Yeah, which is exciting for opportunities if you've got the time to find them.
Absolutely.
And to get it right. But it's not a time when going to work and knowing what you're doing is easy.
No.
And it's exhausting.
Definitely. I agree. Nelson, over to you. You've prepared some slides to give us an overview of the state of the market.
So I'll keep it short and sweet, but basically, I'll just share my screen.